Okay, so in today's lecture, I'd like to go ahead and continue with Unit 4, where we have this examination into user interface management, UI management. And so we've really been spending a great amount of time doing a deep dive into JavaFX, which is a GUI framework available for Java. And so I want to continue that exploration and try to provide as many of the foundational components as possible so that everyone kind of understands the architecture of this framework and sees enough sample code where they can feel comfortable in the future being able to design their own graphic user interfaces to power their applications. So with that said, then the next topic that relates to JavaFX, the core components that we've really been examining thus far, is going to be the CSS styling. So how we can style our components. And so a quick overview for today's lecture will be to produce an introduction on what CSS styling is, and then we'll look at the different methods that we can style our components using JavaFX. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the parent-specific CSS style sheets, we'll look at the component style property, and finally, we'll look at the JavaFX CSS properties. So just a quick introduction here is that JavaFX enables you to style JavaFX components using CSS, just like you can style HTML and SVG elements in a web page with CSS. So JavaFX uses the same CSS syntax as CSS for the web, but the CSS properties are specific to JavaFX and therefore have slightly different namings compared to their web counterparts. So styling your JavaFX applications using CSS helps you separate the styling logic or the looks from your application code. And again, what we're striving to constantly do whenever we develop our code base is identify the different roles and responsibilities and divide that to make the code as easy as possible and as modular as possible in terms of maintainability. So again, we try to define the structure in terms of the XML. We try to define the styling in terms of its aesthetical look using CSS. And then we try to do all of our application logic, which would be our actual Java code. And we want to think of those as being three different pillars towards building a graphic user interface. And so that same kind of separation of responsibility versus style versus your structure and versus your logic is the same approach that web applications use. So if you start thinking of developing your applications that way, you can very easily then transition into a web application space as well. So the results, and one thing that motivates this kind of structure is that the results produce a cleaner application code, and it makes it easier to change the styling of the application. So you don't have to look inside the Java code to change the style, right? You know that all the styling instructions go into CSS files instead. Just like with the XML, you don't have to go into Java code to figure out what the general structure of your user interface elements are. You can go right into the XML and change it that way. And then if you want to go and change the logic, you go right into the Java code. So you can also change the styling for many of the components at once by using a shared CSS style sheet. So in this JavaFX CSS lecture, we will take a deeper look at the many different ways that we can apply CSS styles to our JavaFX applications, as well as look at what we can and can't be styled using the JavaFX CSS. So the JavaFX CSS features are pretty advanced. So there's a lot that you can do with the CSS, and I can't highlight this enough. This isn't a CSS class, right? I don't want to spend too much time talking about CSS, so I'm going to give you a basic overview. It's effectively a declarative language where you can just go ahead and cite what properties. It's like key value pairs where you cite what property you want to affect and you give a value towards that property. And if you wanted to learn more about CSS, there's a lot of great tutorials that are out there that are kind of outside the scope of this class, but you should at least be kind of familiar with what CSS is, because just seeing it and playing around with it a little bit will, again, it would prime you very well to start building out web applications. which if you're interested in building web applications, all of my web application lectures are also on that YouTube channel. So you feel free to be able to compare and contrast. And I think I actually have some lectures on CSS that I could probably link you to and you can watch. Okay, so let's talk about the CSS styling methods. There are several different methods to apply a CSS style to a JavaFX component. We could do the default CSS style sheet. So JavaFX has its own default CSS style sheet. We could do a scene-specific CSS style sheet. We can have a parent-specific CSS style sheet. And then we have the ability to have the style property in each one of our components, one of the JavaFX components that we can go ahead and set the style to. So let's talk a little bit about the default CSS style sheet. So JavaFX applications have a default CSS style sheet, which is applied to all of the JavaFX components. So if you don't provide any styling to your components, then the default CSS style sheet is the style that all of your components will look to make them look attractive and effectively pretty. The default style sheet for JavaFX is called Modena, and it is located in the JavaFX jar file. Then we have scene-specific CSS style sheets. So you can set a CSS style sheet for a JavaFX scene object. So you style a scene at a time using the style sheet. The CSS style sheet is then applied to all of the JavaFX components that's added to that scene graph for that scene object. The scene-specific CSS style sheet will override the styles specified in the default style sheet in case both style sheets sets the same CSS properties. So when it comes to prioritizing, you always have the default style sheet, but then if you create a custom style sheet, it uses those styles as opposed to the default. And if there's a limited number of properties you set in the custom, then it will default to whatever the defaults are that aren't defined in your custom style sheet for that specific scene. So here's an example of setting a CSS style sheet on a scene. So effectively, we have our scene, and then from our scene, we can go ahead and get the style sheet object from it. And then this is going to return back the reference to the style sheet, which has an add method. And so here we can add the style sheets that are attached to this scene. And again, the extension we used for our cascading style sheets is going to be CSS. So the example tells JavaFX to look for a style sheet file called buttonstyles.css, which is located in the directory called style1. JavaFX looks for this file on the class path. So the directory style1 should be located in a directory, which is at the root of one of the directories or jar files, which are included in the class path of your application. The string pointing to the CSS style sheet file is interpreted as a URL, and that means that you can also specify full paths to a file in the file system. However, it's a good practice to think of CSS files as resources and bundle them with your code for your application. The users running the application will typically not be changing the styles, so there's no need to distribute the file outside of your code, like you would with a configuration file that users may need to change for importing various configurations or attributes in your application. Let's talk about the parent-specific CSS style sheet. So it is possible to set a CSS style sheet on all the subclasses of the JavaFX parent class. So the parent class is a base class for all components that can have children, meaning they can contain other components inside them. CSS properties specified in the style sheet are set on a parent. So the subclass will normally take precedence over the CSS rules specified in a scene style sheet and the default style sheet. So again, in the order of priority, you would do the most zoomed in view of the style sheet. So you'd have a parent specific style sheet, which would have the highest priority at this time. Then you would go to the scene specific style sheet, and then it would be the default style sheet. So the JavaFX layout components are typical examples of parent subclasses, which we'll look at the layout classes in a future video. If you set a CSS style sheet on a layout component, the style sheet will be applied to all components inside that layout component. And setting the CSS style sheet on a parent subclass looks similar to setting it on a scene object. But here's an example of setting the CSS style sheet on, say, for instance, a vertical box, which is a parent subclass. So here we would have, let's say, 2 buttons. We take these 2 buttons and add it to this layout component, which is a vertical box. Then this vertical box, just like the scene, has the ability to get style sheets. So if it's a parent subclass, or if it's a scene, then it has that method. And once you have the ability to get the style sheets, then you can add to it your custom style sheet for just that layout component. And then finally, I want to just take a quick examination of the component style property. So you can set CSS styles for a specific component by setting the CSS properties directly on that component. And this is done by setting a string containing the CSS property and the component style property. So CSS properties set via the style property take the highest preference over CSS properties specified in the parent and in the scene and in the default. So we started from the least and we worked our way all the way to the highest priority in kind of reverse order. So here you can kind of set the style on each individual thing, such as a button, for instance, which isn't a layout component, it's an actual like element that would be displayed. And so here in this example, suppose we made a new button, we have a button object here, and then we can say, hey, button set style. And then we can give it the, again, it's a key value pair, right? Delimited by a colon. So here, this represents the property that a button object, that the button element might have. And here it's called FX background color. So that's going to affect the background color. And here, this is the hexadecimal value of the RGB value encoded in R, red, green, blue. So this tells me that the blue is toggled on while green and red is not. So that's going to be a blue button. Okay. So the example sets the background color, CSS property, and the style property to a blue color. And then you could set multiple CSS properties inside the same style string here, just like so. So here I could create a string. I'll call it styles, and I'll just concatenate multiple properties. And so notice the delimiter between each key value pair is a semicolon. So here I would have one property, dash FX dash background dash color, colon illustrates where the key ends and where the value is going to begin. Here I'm going to define my RGB value as a hexadecimal value. So that's going to be the color blue. And then semicolon to say, okay, I'm done with setting that property. And then I'll concatenate another string, which is going to be a new key, which is going to be dash FX dash border dash color. So this will be the border color. And then I'm going to give it a colon to illustrate I'm done defining the key. And now I'm going to pair a value to that key. And the value we're going to bind to that property then is going to be another hexadecimal value for color, which is going to be red, right? So FF is going to be red, and then 0 for green, 0 for blue. So it's going to produce a button with the background color of blue and a border of red. And then I'm going to produce this button, and then I will take that button and set style and just pass that string that has those multiple properties. And lastly, I just want to go and just talk about JavaFX CSS properties. As mentioned earlier, the JavaFX contains its own set of CSS properties. So it's similar to what you'd see on web standards, but it's slightly, the names are slightly changed specific to JavaFX. So you can't do exact styling with the JavaFX property names, but it's pretty close. So the JavaFX CSS properties are named somewhat differently from the CSS properties used with HTML. However, the JavaFX team have kept the names of the JavaFX CSS properties very close to the CSS properties. So if you're familiar with CSS for the web, you will often be able to guess what the corresponding JavaFX CSS properties are called. So here I've attached links inside the PowerPoint library, you can get complete listings of all of the JavaFX CSS properties so that you can just look those up and easily be able to see what they are as you want to go ahead and define them. And so I just want to do a very quick crash course on how we can take CSS and utilize that in our JavaFX apps. So really, that's all I wanted to say about that. Let me see here. I don't think I even have any sample code that actually uses, we'll see. Okay, let's see here. I don't think I have any, yeah, I didn't bother doing any sample code for the CSS stuff. And again, if you want to learn more about CSS in general, you can just go to the lectures that I have related to CSS.